Welcome everybody, on behalf of Authors at Google, to another Authors at Google Talk. Today's guest, David Graeber, his new book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years of It. Please welcome David Graeber.
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me here. I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about how I came to write the book. It's an odd book in a way because it starts from trying to grapple with kind of a moral and political problem, which is what is this hold that the idea of debt has over people's imaginations, that morality itself comes to be thought of as a matter of paying one's debts. I guess I was first really confronted with it, conceived the notion of writing this book when I was for some reason or another, I was at a garden party at Westminster Abbey. And I won't go into how I got there, but it was a curious experience. The priest, who was a very nice man named Father Graham, was sort of introducing me to everyone there, but he had this very annoying way of doing it. He would sort of bring me up to people and say, "Hello, I'd like you to meet David Graeber. He's an anarchist." It's kind of limited conversations possibilities a lot. But after a while, he introduced me to this person who he said was I'd have a lot in common with, a activist lawyer, who's involved in a lot of community work and various things like that. So I chatted with her, and she was talking about her activism and asked me about mine. And I was talking about campaigns that I'd been involved in the global justice movement for many years, about the IMF structural adjustment policies and their effects on various parts of the world. I had spent 2 years in Madagascar, and Madagascar had undergone all sorts of IMF structural adjustment over the years with various confusing effects. Some of them were actually kind of ironically quite good, like the state basically sort of pulled up stakes and left large parts of the countryside because they figured they weren't getting any taxes out of the countryside anyway, and people sort of managing their own affairs completely autonomously, and that was cool. But they also did things like withdraw support for mosquito eradication programs. The idea being IMF would set the terms for debt rescheduling and demand various budget cuts. In this case, there was a program that had been put in 50 years before to wipe out malaria in the highlands, which had been very successful. People had all lost their immunity, but they couldn't afford to keep it up anymore when they had to cut the budget. And as a result, I believe 15,000 people died. 10 or 15, depending on the accounts, because the epidemic came back, everyone had lost their immunity. At least 5,000 of those were children. And this had happened right before I came to Madagascar. A lot of people were naturally quite devastated by the experience. And I was telling this story, and she was very sympathetic, and she said, "Well, yes, but what were you, as an activist, what were you proposing to do about this?" And I said, "Well, we were involved in the Drop the Debt campaign. This thing called Jubilee 2000, so the debt of the global south should be forgiven." And her reaction was somewhat shocked and mortified. She was like, "Well, but they borrowed the money, I mean, surely people have to pay their debts." It was something about the way it was just so commonsensical. And as an activist, your first reaction when you see this is say, "Oh, that conversation, all right. I thought this was a friend. Okay, wait, which one do I do?" There's like 12 different responses you can do. Do I say, well, they didn't really borrow the money, some dictator who put it in a Swiss bank account? Do you say, well, actually they've paid the money about 20 times over at this point, just through the miracle of compounded interest, they'll never get out. There's a million different responses. Actually, the response I think I came up with, thought would be most effective in that context, was the economical one, which is, if profits are your reward for taking a risk, well, you're supposed to be taking a risk. So, I mean, the whole point of a financial system is to guide money towards wise investments, and if you have a system like the IMF imposed on most of the world where you're going to get paid back no matter what you do, there's absolutely no incentive to make intelligent loans. But what really struck me was that sort of commonsensical, you have to pay your debts. I thought, well, this is a very nice person. She just heard a story which involved 7,000 dead babies. What other circumstance would she try to justify killing 7,000 babies? Probably not. So what is it about the idea of debt that it can justify things in people's minds that you'd almost never imagine defending otherwise? And it set me off, and I started thinking about debt itself. And the history of debt, what is debt? Where does it come from? How long have we been thinking in these terms? How long has it had this moral power? And I quickly, when I started doing initial research, discovered a number of rather surprising things. One of them was that no one has ever written a history of debt, which is kind of shocking because really there aren't that many things that no one's ever written a history of. If you think about it, people have written histories of salt. People have written histories of different types of fish. There's a French historian who wrote a history of shit. It's actually human waste disposal over the years. Pretty much anything you can think of, there's a guy who's written a history of that. How is it that no one's ever written a history of debt? People have written lots of histories of money, but the histories of money almost invariably turn out, when you look at them, to be histories of coinage, which itself is interesting when you consider that most transactions over world history have been credit transactions. And you can find histories of credit, but it's not exactly the same thing. So here's this thing which pervades every aspect of our lives. Modern nations run on deficit financing. Consumer economies run on debt. International relationships are all about debt. Yet, no one's quite sure what it is, and no one's written a history of the phenomena. So I started to work, and one of the first things I found was that most of our sort of basic common sense reigning assumptions about this are completely wrong. The other thing I found out is that this moral ambivalence, which is interesting, that sort of commonsensical, but of course you have to pay your debt, and then the argument, but actually really no, that doesn't make any sense. That conversation has been happening for about 5,000 years itself. Throughout the history of debt, conversations like that keep happening. It seems that there's almost no time and place where you can't find people, on the one hand, treating the payment of debts as simple morality, or even treating simple morality as the paying of debts. But at the same time, then concluding there's something very wrong with this, and they need to imagine some other way to think of it, but it not being clear what that is. I could multiply examples endlessly, but one or two will just give you the idea. Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic begins, what is justice? This is the founding work of Western political philosophy, right? And sort of wealthy arms manufacturer Cephalos, his name actually means capital. He says, oh, that's simple, just pay your debts and don't lie. That's justice. Socrates blows that one out of the water right away, of course. He says, well, okay, some guy lends me his sword and then he goes violently insane and wants it back to kill people. Like, do I give it back? Of course not. And probably I'll make up some lie as to why I can't. So they start with that and say, all right, not that, something else. Maybe I mean it metaphorically. And the rest of the book is basically the, okay, not that, maybe something else then. But that, it's debt, right? And no, actually it's not. That shows up over and over and over again. In a way, all the world religions start that way too. You have the Brahmanas, sort of first great theological texts of Hinduism after the Rig Veda. They're discussing debt, and debt and sin are actually the same. Debt, guilt, and sin are really the same word in Sanskrit. So they start with this idea of cosmic debt. What is life? Life is a debt we owe to the gods. So, we owe our lives to the gods. We pay interest in the form of animal sacrifice and other rituals, and then gradually we pay the principal back when we die. So they pose this as the sort of human existence itself is a debt. All morality is debt. But as soon as they start extending it, it becomes clear that that's not really what they mean, because they say, well, you also have a existential debt, not only to the gods and to the cosmos, but you have an existential debt to your parents. How do you pay them back? You become a parent. You owe a debt to the sages who created wisdom, like you're reading now. How do you pay that back? You become a sage. You learn things. You owe a debt to humanity as a whole for making your life possible. How do you pay back that? You're hospitable to strangers. But in every case, what you're doing is you are undermining the basis for saying there even is a debt. You're not paying it back, because after all, as in the example to parents, if somebody lends you money and you give the money to someone else, you're not actually paying it back. But what you are doing is you're owe a debt to your parents, and then you become a parent. So you're annihilating the difference. You owe a debt to the sages, you become a sage. You owe a debt to humanity, you become humane. Could that apply to the cosmos? Well, yes, according to most Hindu scripture, that's exactly what's happening, because you are the cosmos. And if you think about it, the idea that you owe a debt to the cosmos, and this crops up again and again, debt to nature, debt to society, debt to these huge institutions larger than yourself, is kind of absurd, because a debt is a business transaction. And a business transaction is by definition an arrangement between two legally equivalent entities. They make a deal. Now, how would you enter into a business transaction with the entire universe, everything that is or has ever been, including yourself? You kind of make a deal with them. Well, it's absurd. So the only way to actually sort of undo the debt is what they're saying, is what you realize in rituals, if you're doing them right, is that you are the cosmos. There is no difference. So there is no basis to say there's a debt at all. So again, it's the same thing. You start morality is just debt, everything is a debt, but they say it in such a way that once you figure out what they're really saying no, actually, it's not. Debt is absurd. Same thing happens in the Bible. In Aramaic, the word for debt and sin is also the same word. Actually, the Lord's Prayer, which we always remember through the Anglican translation, which is, "Oh, forgive us our trespasses, just as we forgive those who trespass against us." Translated into this odd private property terms. But the original Aramaic and the original John Wycliffe translation is debt. Forgive us our debts, just as we forgive those who owe us money. But of course, there's kind of a message there, right? Because we don't actually forgive those who owe us money, generally speaking. So in a way, it's a way of saying, like, you're a sinner. You don't deserve anything. But in fact, grace will come and you'll be forgiven. So what is sacred isn't actually paying back debts, it's forgiveness of debts, which was a tradition, going back to ancient Mesopotamian debt forgiveness and the biblical Jubilee, which is adopted from that, where periodically debts are canceled. And that is a divine act. So what's divine is not paying debts, what's divine is forgiving debts. Cancellation. So over and over, you have that same situation where people start with an assumption that morality and debt are the same. And they immediately say, except really they aren't, and sort of cast around for some other basis on which to think of a universal morality, often having a great deal of difficulty in doing so. It's even more complicated because when you do think of debt as sin, there's a question of who is the sinner. This crops up over and over again too, just about everywhere. The person who borrows the money has probably done something wrong, especially if they haven't paid it right away. The person who lent it is not doing much better. In fact, one thing that happens over and over again in so many different traditions is you find that, borrowing money, or they frame morality as the obligation of the borrower to pay it back. So obligation, debt, are considered the same thing. Morality is just doing your obligations, it's paying your debts. On the other hand, in almost every one of those traditions, money lenders are assumed to be evil. Well, it's kind of hard to square those. And sometimes in the same text, they'll just be sort of jockeying back and forth, trying to figure out who's the bad guy. There's a great Buddhist story from medieval Japan I use in the first chapter because it just brings it home so clearly. It's kind of a case of premature reincarnation. There's a Buddhist monk telling the story about some book about strange events in Japan in my day, which is maybe like 700 AD. There's some woman whose wife of the governor is a notorious local loan shark, and she terrorizes people, and so is chasing them down. And we're fleeing the province in droves from her depredations. She dies, and after 3 days of saying prayer over the body, something horrible happens. Coffin opens and she jumps out, but she's half an ox. And this horrible monster that sort of lingers for a few days, and the family panics and is trying to give back all the money that they'd extracted from people, hoping that she'll just mercifully die and the whole episode will be over, which eventually she does. But the monk is reflecting on this, and he says, well, it says in the sutras that if you owe somebody money and you don't pay, well, this is bad because you're in mortal danger. You could be reborn as an ox in their barn. That's what happens to debtors a lot. But he says, I guess, well, if somebody owes you money and you're really giving them a hard time, then you could get reborn an ox in their barn. And that must be what was about to happen to her, but she was so bad, it wasn't even clear whose ox she was going to be born in, so she got turned into this monster. I thought about this and I thought, well, yeah, it's a perfect example, because you're not going to be shaking somebody down unless they didn't pay. But if they didn't pay, then they're in danger of being born an ox in your barn. So who's going to you can't both get born an ox in the other guy's barn. Somebody's got to be worse. So who decides? There's some sort of karmic balance. It's touch and go. Either one could actually end up an ox. And I think that really brings home the problem you always have in debt. One party is in moral peril, definitely. The other one, probably. And when you imagine all human relations as exchange, that's what crops up. There's a terrible ambivalence, therefore, about the very nature of human sociality. And sometimes people do it in a positive way. I should point out that one of the points I make in the book is that human relations are not all exchange. There are many different moral registers in which we interact with one another, and exchange is just one. But when you have exchange, exchange is a relationship between two equal partners where based on reciprocity, they should actually give each other an equivalent, maybe on the spot, maybe over time. If the transaction is not complete, there's a debt. But once it is complete, they're equal once again and they walk away. But the curious thing about that is it means that if you're working on the level of exchange, then you only have relationships with one another when the exchange is incomplete, in which case one party is definitely to blame because they haven't paid back what they owe. The other one might well be. It implies that sociality itself, human relations, only exist when somebody's done something wrong. When you have deeply commercial philosophies of life, often that's the conclusion. In other places, debt becomes good. It becomes the basis of sociality. It's very, very common in a lot of places. There's a great story I always sort of brings us home about these people called the Tiv who live in central Nigeria. And there's an anthropologist named Laura Bohannon. Wrote up her experiences when she first did field work there. So she shows up, gets a house, doesn't really know the language very well. People immediately start appearing with gifts. And somebody will bring a little basket of okra, somebody will bring some fish, some grain, potatoes. And she doesn't know what to do, of course. She's an anthropologist. She gets out a little notebook and writes everything down. Her living room gradually filling up with baskets of various types of goods. And so eventually someone takes pity on her and says, okay, look, this is the deal. Those are gifts, but you have to give people something back. Figure out what they're worth. But the key is you can't give them back something of the exact same value of what they just gave you. So that okra is worth 3 shillings. Give them something worth 2 shillings or give them something worth 4 shillings. Never give them something worth 3 shillings, because if you do, you're saying, I don't want to have anything more to do with you. So people have to be in each other's debt, just a little bit. And that way you always have an excuse to oh, by the way, I still owe you a shilling on that. So everybody has an excuse to see each other. And so in a way, sociality is debt. Everybody has to be just a little bit in debt to everybody else. And if you look at the way communities work over the course of history where they do have money, very often that's what being a neighborhood means. Everybody's a little bit in debt to everybody else. Medieval England. I think somebody calculated that 97% of all transactions in a typical English village, and this is true through till at least the 1700s, were by credit. Partly there just isn't a lot of money floating around, partly people don't like to use it with neighbors, as we'll see. actual physical money is associated with war, violent soldiers, people you really don't want to hang out with, criminals. Nice people operate on credit and trust. So everybody's doing these credit transactions and everybody's keeping track in their head. So I owe him 5 shillings, he owes him 3. And every 6 months to a year, they have what they call communal reckoning. So everybody sits down in a big circle and they say, all right, I owe you 7 shillings, he owes him 7 shillings, he owes him, he owes me. Okay, big circle, we can cancel that one out. And they just do a bunch of loops and they gradually whittle it down until they figure out there's about 3 shillings left over between this guy and that guy, and what is actually owed, and then somebody gives somebody a pig, some cheese, whatever it might be, and they settle it and go back to zero again and start. And that's community. Community means everybody owes everybody something else. Everybody remembers what they owe, and eventually they all settle it and start over again. Now, so in that sense, debt isn't a terrible thing. But there's always that shadow, like sin floating over it. And there's that terrible ambivalence that we're saying that, one party's guilty, the other one might be. Where does that come from? And when I began exploring this, one of the first things I looked at was the history of money itself. Because I said, okay, what is a debt? A debt is essentially a promise which you can phrase in exactly quantifiable terms. Because you can quantify it, it's impersonal. And because it's impersonal, it's transferable. So, if I promise you that I will meet you at 5 o'clock, you can't actually transfer that to someone else, normally speaking. It's an assumption, as you could. But a promise which is quantifiable, I promise you, give you exactly this amount of things, you actually can turn over to someone else. And in a way that, according to many theories, that's what money actually is a transferable promise to render a certain amount of goods. One of the great questions is how that comes about. Why the need to quantify promises happens, or to quantify them precisely. And we've had a story about why this happens that you read in your basic economic 101 textbook. It was actually invented by Adam Smith in 1776. The Wealth of Nations is the first time you see someone really making the argument in detail. And it continues to be the story that everybody knows and learns. They pick up somewhere or another. It becomes common sense. And here, as an anthropologist, I must say that I have a kind of a pet peeve in this respect, because it's a professional pet peeve on the part of anthropologists. Because this story was told, over 200 years ago. Almost immediately, we started going out in the world trying to find examples of people who do it, and we couldn't. It's not true. But they never changed the textbooks. We just can't get them to come up with a different story. But all right, here's the story. You've all heard it before. Once upon a time, people lived in villages and they used to swap things. There was barter. Say I wanted somebody's cow. Well, I said, all right, hey, I need a cow. Tell you what, I'll give you 30 chickens for that cow. And the guy's like, well, I don't know, 30's not much. 40 chickens, 45. All right, sold. So you come to some sort of arrangement. Swap. Go home. But the problem is maybe the guy doesn't want chickens. Maybe he doesn't happen to have anything he wants right now. What happens? Well, you can't make a deal, right? So the only way out of this problem pops up more and more over time, is to settle on something that everybody usually wants, like gold for some reason. Shiny metal, but it's kind of handy and pretty. There's a virtuous circle. The moment you start using it as a general equivalent, everybody needs it all the time. It turns into money. So barter is inconvenient, you get money, government gets involved and starts stamping the stuff for uniform weights and quality, although it starts cheating all the time and debasing the currency because governments are bad in this version. Gradually you invent credit systems, and it's an evolutionary series. Barter, money, credit, securitized derivatives and whatnot are just sort of the last link in the chain, and follows logically. All right, so that's the story. As I say, there's one big problem. We've been scouring the world for over 200 years now, and we have never found a single community where everyday transactions take the form of, I'll give you 40 chickens for that cow. It's just they don't exist. Adam Smith himself had no way to know this. He was just speculating, but now we do, and they keep on telling the story. if you look at contemporary economic textbooks, the old ones used to say, well, primitive people do this, you know, and now that they kind of know it's not true, they don't want to stop. So instead they say, well, imagine you didn't have money. What would you have to do? How would you get breakfast? Well, you'd have to barter, wouldn't you? And they tell this story as a kind of parable, which is basically what it is. There's an obvious reason, if you think about it, there's an obvious problem with the story, why it wouldn't happen, which is, you know, you're taking a Neolithic village, you're a bunch of people who are neighbors, and you are assuming that they will only deal with each other with what, you know, economists like to call the spot trade. Here, I'm going to give you this, you're going to give me that, we walk away. But of course, why would they do that, right? I mean, they're neighbors. If the guy doesn't want my chickens, he knows I'm going to have something he wants because I'm his neighbor. In fact, it's rather nice to have your neighbor in your debt. It's useful for all sorts of things. So, you know, even if you take this imaginary scenario here, these two guys in a Neolithic village, one wants a cow, what would really happen? Well, in fact, in many human societies, it is the case that if you praise somebody else's possession, it's almost impossible not to give it to the person who praises it. This is another one of those things which has a very, very strange moral power, so much so that you really can't break out of it. I mean, there's a great story I always tell from New Zealand, a Maori story about a guy named Te Renga. This is a sort of notorious glutton. He rarely did much fishing himself. Everybody else in the neighborhood was a fisherman. And he would sort of walk up and down the beach looking for people coming back from fishing and or check out their catch and say, oh, look, you got squid. Oh, I love squid. That's my favorite. You know, or, wow, that's a beautiful fish. And I'll be like, okay, here's a fish. You know, okay, here's a squid. So they just have to give it to him. After about 2 years of this, people got fed up, so they formed a war party and they killed him. It's actually easier to just bash the guy's head in than to say, no, I'm not going to give you the fish. So such is the moral power of some customs. At any rate, so here you have, if you praise somebody, I have a friend from Lebanon said where she grew up, it was the same thing. You know, if somebody praises your scarf or piece of jewelry, you just have to say, take it. There's only one way out, actually, which is to say, oh, you like it? It was a gift. Anyway, so, all right, here you have the situation. So I want a cow. I go up, I say, wow, that is one magnificent cow. It's a really beautiful cow you got there. So the guy, you know, there's only one thing he can do. He says, oh, you want the cow? Well, oh no, please take the cow. It's a really stupid cow, but you know, if you like it, you should really have it. No, don't even think about giving me anything back. It's a gift, of course. We were neighbors, we love each other, just take the cow. Now, he owes you one. And everybody knows that, nobody will say it. But what does he owe? He owes you something roughly like a cow. And that's what you get in communities like this. You get this sort of rank system of types of things. So a cow, a canoe, a very nice necklace are roughly the same. You could give one back for the other. Or, you know, it's not necessarily that, because you could give something back to him, or he could just show up because, you know, you owe him one, and he could just say, well, wow, that's a beautiful necklace you have. Or you could say, you know, my son is deeply in love with your daughter. You know, it could be a lot of things. You know, it isn't necessarily a material good. I really need help for something. So, but you have this sort of quantified rank system. And, you know, there's all sorts of ways you can head it off. You can play games. You could, like, say, oh, I hate owing that guy a cow. I know, I just got a whole bunch of yams, I'll give them to him, I'll be off the hook. And, you know, he'll be like, oh, yams, great, thanks. You know, so he might mock you as a cheapskate, which is a devastating thing in a small community. But here's the thing, he's very unlikely to come up with a mathematical formula for exactly how cheap he thinks you were, right? And that's the problem. How do you get from, like, a cow is roughly like this to 27 yams equals one cow, but not 3? How many chickens equals a cow? In the barter story, there's a mechanism, but, you know, if there's this sort of rough credit system is what you'd actually have and what you actually do observe in places without money, well, how does that turn into something where you can figure out exact proportional equivalence? The answer to that seems to be when somebody's very angry. Now, when people are being nice to each other, there's really no need to calculate, but occasionally it will happen that people, violence ensues. Say I am mocking someone for giving me these yams, and he's drunk, I'm drunk, violence ensues, somebody's ear gets cut off. Well, then there's numbers. Very often, it is the case that even in places where you don't have markets for goods, you do have incredibly elaborate series of fines and penalties for damaged limbs. If you lose a finger, it's worth this much. If you lose a thumb, it's worth that much. If you lose an eye, if you have a gash like this large, and we'll measure the gash and how many, chickens or heifers or silver plates or whatever it might be. What they call the Barbarian Law Codes. It seemed like every society in early medieval Europe wrote up a schedule of fines like this, and some of them are incredibly detailed. The early Welsh and Irish ones are especially interesting because we know they didn't have markets. You couldn't buy or sell things, most things, but they did have prices on everything. In fact, they specify the exact value of every single object likely to be found in a person's house, ranging from the silverware to the roof beams, everything, the curtains. Why? Because you will end up in a situation often where the law says you owe me 27 heifers, or this means war. Swords are pulled. People are not willing to compromise. You killed my brothers. You insulted my mother, whatever it might be. You need to pay penalties, and you don't have heifers. Well, then you actually need to figure out exactly what's equivalent to what. So in those circumstances, in legal situations, particularly where there's a danger of a feud or outbreak of violence, in fact, people do need to quantify. And it seems like that's the first circumstance where you have something like money emerging. That association, then, of money and violence is a constant. And it helps to explain a lot about why debt in particular tends to take on this incredibly powerful moral hold. One way I like to put it is that if you are in a situation of inequality, of violent inequality, probably the most effective technique ever invented to not only make that seem moral, but to make it seem like the victim is to blame, is to frame it in the language of debt. Mafiosi understand this perfectly well, right? But sort of heads of conquering armies, you come in, you say, all right, I've conquered you guys. And it's actually important to bear in mind here that there's a famous line from Benjamin Franklin, there's nothing certain in life but death and taxes. That's not actually true. It's only death. In many societies, they did, ancient Sumer, communities didn't tax themselves. Taxes were just placed on conquered populations. The same was true in Athens. In fact, they had negative taxes in Athens. The government gave you money. You were paid to vote. Just gave periodic handouts from government resources. Rome had bread and circuses. So citizens didn't usually have to pay taxes. Taxes was tribute placed on people who'd been conquered, but the general excuse was, debt, you owe me your lives. Why do you owe me your lives? Because I could have killed you and I didn't. So, of course, I expect payment for this, compensation. I'm a nice guy, I'm gonna let you off the hook for 6 months. And if you're in trouble, we can negotiate something, but I do expect payment. And voila, you've turned a relation of violent inequality into a relation where the victims are running around feeling inadequate all the time, making terrible apologies for themselves, and you get to be the magnanimous nice guy. It happens over and over again in world history, and it's very, very effective. The problem is it tends to blow up in your face because, from the perspective of power, there's that little worm in the bud, which is you're translating things into the language of a business deal, which implies that you should be equal. You are equal on some level. If you owe a debt to someone, there's a contract here, but one party has failed to live up to their end of the contract. Now, if you think about it, there's a real explosive potential there. And if you look at world history, in fact, the vast majority of rebellions, revolutions, insurrections, peasant revolts that you see are not about the kind of thing you probably think it would be. They're not about slavery. Slave revolts happen, but they're pretty rare. They're not about caste systems. They're not about serfdom, absolute declared systems of inequality. They're always about debt. Moses Finley, the great classicist, once said that There was basically one revolutionary program throughout antiquity, which is cancel the debts and redistribute the land, in that order. When peasants take over a town, the first thing they do is they find the debt records and burn them. After that, they go after the land registers and maybe the tax documents. And this remains true throughout history. I mean, I was actually going through just recently some of the writings of John Adams and others of the founding fathers, their reflections on democracy, which of course they were totally against. Those guys hated democracy. And John Adams has this quote saying, well, we can't have majority vote. If we had majority vote, then we have 2 million people with property, 9 million people without property. What's going to happen? Moment we allow everybody to vote, first thing that's going to happen is they'll cancel the debts. After that, they'll redistribute the land. It's just common sense. So this is the program. And why debt? Why does debt mobilize people in this way? Because it implies that you're equal. So, if you say you are inferior, you're a peasant, if you're a serf, I'm a lord, it's not going to make people very happy, but you can live with that. But if you say, well, you're supposed to be my equal, but you messed up, you are morally inadequate, well, it's kind of hard not to take that and say, now, wait a minute, if we're equal, why are you saying I messed up? I mean, who owes what to who here, really? And that is, of course, what people have said for the last 5,000 years when confronted that. Almost invariably, the response is, who owes what to who? But once you do that, you're using the language of debt, right? You're saying that debt is morality. You're saying, well, wait a minute, we make your food, in terms of any reasonable morality, I'm the guy. You should be owing me owing you. But suddenly the language of debt does become all pervasive because you have to use the master's language. And I think that's what we're dealing with all those religious texts, with all this philosophical text, which start by saying debt is just morality and then say, except actually it's not. You're stuck with the language of debt as a way of arguing about politics. I mean, we don't know what if this is 2000 BC in Mesopotamia and two guys are sitting around the tavern arguing about politics, what kind of phrases and language they're using. But we can be pretty certain that debt is a big one in there. And we can also be pretty certain that when we're reading all these great religious texts, that language of ordinary, everyday political argument is in there. The thing is, we don't have this anymore. So we're probably reading all these sort of Mesopotamian equivalent of "it's the economy, stupid," or all these various catchphrases that everybody knew at the time that we just don't know anymore. So they're just throwing them around and it becomes lodged. And this is why all this moral language becomes this financial language. And you talk about redemption and reckoning and so forth, and debt and sin and so forth and so on. So you're stuck with this language of debt, except it periodically blows up. Next, when I started looking at the broad sweep of history, I thought, well, you can look at social movements and organization of society in those terms, and perhaps one of the most revealing ways of doing that is looking at the history of money itself. Remember, we have this paradigm. First there is barter, then there's money, then comes credit, and that's wrong. Not only is it wrong, it's actually backwards. Credit comes first. Somehow or other, by the time the sort of curtain comes up around 3500 BC in Mesopotamia, you already have very elaborate credit systems. Actually, the very first document we have, which talks about interest rates, is a political document by a king, I believe his name, a Sumerian king, who's complaining about his neighbors occupying a stretch of territory which is rightfully his. And he says, well, they've been occupying this land for 20 years. If we calculate the rent we would have charged them had they been renting the same land, and then add a compounded interest rate, I calculate that they would actually owe us, 13 trillion shekels, or whatever, some insanely sum that no one could possibly pay. Obviously, this means war. So, you've already got compounded interest rates and so forth going on in the very, very first records that we have. People have expense accounts, bar tabs. It seems like almost all everyday transactions are on credit. And the evidence for that is scales, because they were denominating debts in silver, but they didn't actually make scales accurate enough to weigh out the tiny amounts of silver that would have been required to buy a shirt or a hammer or something like that in the marketplace. They had the technology to do so, they just didn't bother. So clearly people weren't actually using silver to buy this stuff. They were running off a tab. All right, so you've got this Sumerian situation with the same king. You know what he does after he declares war on Lagash, or the rival place, wins. And what does he do after that? He declares a debt cancellation. Because it seems, for everybody in the kingdom, because it seems that the problem you have these credit systems, money is basically in a set of IOUs denominated in silver, although silver, unless you're merchants dealing with large transactions, rarely actually changes hands. The problem is in bad years, people fall into debt. Because also these silver and grain are fixed in relation to each other. That's what money actually is, but that's a big problem. If if there's a bad harvest, the price doesn't go up. You're stuck. The farmers fall terribly into debt. As a result, people start taking away their flocks, taking away their fields, taking away members of their family. Debt peonage becomes a huge phenomena. They start running away, joining nomad bands outside the city. Society seems to be breaking down. So kings will normally come in and sort of declare a clean slate. All right, commercial debts can stay on the books usually, but consumer debt will wipe them out, start over again. This becomes a habit and becomes systematized in the biblical Jubilee every 7 to 49 years, depending on your reading. Debts are wiped out, everybody gets to go home. In fact, the first recorded word for freedom in any human language is the Sumerian word amargi, which literally means return to mother, because that's what happens. They declare debt cancellation, all the debt peons get to go home. So this virtual money system comes first, which is always very entertaining because people have this tendency to write about virtual money as a new phenomena. We're in this brave new world. Actually, it's the original form of money. Coins come later. Barter, incidentally, tends to only really show up when you have people who are used to using money but actually can't get their hands on any. So you do have documented places where people do say, I'll give you 20 chickens for that cow, but in almost every case, it's something like, Russia in the 90s, where the economy falls apart, or the money supply vanishes, and people are trying to carry on as if they had money without money. Or in a prison, they turn cigarettes into money because they're all used to using money. Now, here's the interesting thing. Coins are invented nearly simultaneously. It happens first in Lydia in the Eastern Mediterranean, but shortly thereafter, at least in broad historical terms, it happens in the Ganges Plain in northern India and in the plains of northern China, Ganges Valley, I'm sorry. And in every case, through different physical techniques. In one case stamped, in one case cast. But the social situation seems to be the same, which is that money in the physical sense, currency, is actually invented to pay soldiers. And it makes perfect sense if you think about it, because gold and silver are what money is denominated with, and you can use it for exchange, but it just isn't usually done. But soldiers are exactly the sort of people who are most likely to be doing this. First of all, from the perspective of a soldier, gold and silver has a huge advantage over a credit arrangement, because you can't actually steal a credit arrangement. You can't run off of it. On the other hand, gold and silver, it's kind of your equivalent of the suitcase full of $100 bills. Nobody knows where it's from, nobody asks, anybody will take it. So for soldiers, that's very nice. You can also melt it down, divide it up into small portions. So soldiers are likely to be carrying around loot. And second of all, if you have elaborate credit arrangements as the major way of transacting, well, a heavily armed guy who's just passing through is probably the person you'd least like to extend credit to if you can possibly avoid it. If he's carrying around little bits of gold and silver, well, good. So cash markets, insofar as they seem to first emerge, will tend to emerge right around wherever armies are parked, or where they have recently looted things and are, trying to get rid of the little bits of gold and silver and acquire the wine, women, and song and various other things that they like. Governments very quickly get in on the deal, and in fact, one interesting thing is by the Adam Smith account, if money just sort of emerges from the need to get over the inconveniences of barter, well, it would be very hard to understand why governments demanded taxes in money. It might seem self-evident, but the moment you think about it, it isn't, because if gold and silver are just money, well, why not just grab the gold and silver mines? And in fact, governments would do that. I mean, ancient kings would normally grab the gold and silver mines. In theory, you have all the gold and silver you want, you got all the money. Why would you then take the stuff, stamp your picture on it, give it to people and say, okay, everybody in the kingdom has to give me one of these back again? Think about it, it's kind of odd. But it makes perfect sense if you're trying to feed an army. You know, here you have this army of 100,000 people. They're sitting in town on the border. Well, how are you going to get food to them? Under ancient conditions, unless they're next to the ocean, you know, where it's easy, relatively easy to move stuff around. It's extremely difficult to move around large amounts of grain. They're going to eat everything within walking distance in a matter of weeks. So what are you going to do? Either you have to employ, you know, another 100,000 people just bringing them stuff, or you can give them all tiny little pieces of metal with your picture on it and say, okay, everybody in the kingdom has to give me one back. Voila, you've just employed your entire population, you know, getting soldiers things they want. And that's essentially what taxation systems have done throughout world history. I mean, colonial empires did this very, very self-consciously, like in Madagascar, where I was. First thing the French did, they said, okay, we've just conquered you. That was very expensive, outfitting an army, or you're going to have to pay us back for the cost of having conquered you. We will issue paper money, and you will have to give, you know, 10 of those back to us every year. You know, it was a way of creating a market. Somehow or another, you're going to have, you know, they actually called it the, you know, the moralizing tax to teach people the value of work. You know? So money and taxes have been used throughout the centuries as ways of creating markets. Which is very interesting because we have this assumption that markets and governments, and particularly war-making governments, are opposed principles, and that, you know, political choice for the last century or so has largely revolved around which one we're going to slant to. Are we going to go more on the government side, more on the market side? Those are the two sort of logical human possibilities. Ever since people like Herbert Spencer wrote in early 19th century, we've always assumed there's an opposition between these things. Historically, in fact, no. Markets tend to be created by governments as a side effect of military operations. They sometimes take on a life of their own, but, you know, the origins, they're very closely linked. So to go back to these periods of history, so you have this first period of virtual money. Coinage is invented around 600 BC. Karl Jaspers, the German existential philosopher, coined the phrase the Axial Age for this period. And he pointed out that almost all major schools, both of world philosophy and the great world religions, crop up within a relatively short period of time. If you extend it from 600 BC to 600 AD, it's exactly, starts happening exactly the times and places where they invent coinage. Uncanny. It's even in the same cities in Greece. Miletos, which is the place where first Greek city where they're using coins in everyday transactions, is where they invent Greek philosophy at exactly the same time. In China it happens, in India it happens. World religions arise. The world religions arise largely as peace movements against these empires that are using the coins. And people have talked about Axial Age as being characterized by a military coinage slavery complex. Actually, they say military coinage, but I'll throw in slavery. Because chattel slavery, which isn't a major institution either before or after in Indian and Chinese history, for example, becomes really big just in this little slice of time. People take these standing armies, they pay them in cash. Alexander's army, for example, I think it took half a ton of silver a day to pay the army. Where did they get this silver? Well, the armies would besiege cities, take lots of prisoners, enslave them, send them to the mines, and then they make more metal to feed the army again. So it became this giant cycle. So coins are actually found pretty much where armies are throughout the ancient world. In Rome, it was in Italy. I mean, 90% of all finds of Roman coins are in Italy and along the border where the armies were stationed. All right, so Axial Age, you have this rise of world religions. They start as peace movements. There's this kind of mutual division of social territory in a way, because before that you don't really have impersonal markets, you have credit markets. When you have impersonal markets based on cash, the idea is, well, it's almost like saying, well, here's a space where, well, just think about material goods and getting as much of them for yourself as possible. And it almost makes sense that somebody, if you do that, someone else will say, all right, and here's a space, we'll call it religion, where we think about why material things are not important and why it's better to give than to receive, and charity and things like that always crop up as an idea. It never really existed before as a conception in human history, exactly the same places you get these impersonal markets as part of these religions. So you get that, but gradually the empires come to a crisis, they start crumbling, they adopt the world religions, Confucianism in China, Ashoka adopts Buddhism, Constantine goes for Christianity. At exactly the moment the empire is starting to fall apart, it doesn't really work, empires dissolve, and you get the Middle Ages where once the standing armies dissolve, all the gold and silver basically gets put back in churches and monasteries. People go back to credit systems. And the world religions take over the regulation of these large elaborate credit systems. And so, for example, in the Middle East, checks are invented and widely used. Already in Basra around 800 or 900, people were reporting a majority of transactions in the marketplace are by check. Check is actually an Arab word, meaning check. Yeah, I always like to point out to people when they talk about financial globalization as if this is somehow a new phenomena. Like, think about the terms cash and checks, cash or check. Like, check is an Arab word meaning check, and cash, well, it's a double etymology, but one of them apparently is originally a Tamil word for Chinese money. How did that happen? So, all right, so you have this world where people are going back to use of credit. We say, in the Middle Ages, the Europe reverted to barter. Not true. In fact, if you look at the records, they're not bartering things. They're actually using money, but they're using money that doesn't physically exist. So they're still using Roman currency and denominating everything in Roman currency until Charlemagne, and then they're using Carolingian currency, but the Carolingian currency only actually exists for maybe 20 years, and some of it doesn't exist at all. So like pounds, shillings, and pence originally come from Charlemagne's system. He never actually made pounds, he never got around to it, but they were using it to measure things, and they actually called this imaginary money. So whatever the king was actually putting out, that was one thing, but you had this sort of ideal system which spanned Europe, everybody knew what it was, and so you could trade and do it on the basis of this money that didn't actually exist. And they actually even had a phenomenon they used to call crying up or crying down the currency. So a king could say, all right, whatever we're using right now, it used to be 17 of these pennies were a shilling. I'm going to change it, now it'll be 13. So he could inflate the currency if he was in debt, or if he wanted to raise taxes, he'd lower it. So he just rearranged whatever the currency was being used, which was only used for occasionally things, because again, most transactions were on credit in relation to, or they could recall it. I mean, the king sometimes said, okay, let's recall the money and I'll give it back again next year. And commerce would not stop because everything was based on credit systems. Similarly, in China, they invent paper money, which originally comes out of the government taking credit instruments that people are using and adopting it themselves. That's what they do in China. They any type of innovation, first they try to suppress it and they say, okay, we'll do it for you. So it's all privatized in the Islamic world and it becomes public in China. Actually, there are very opposite principles, but in Islam in particular in this period, you get the first real free market ideology. And this is a fascinating thing. I mean, a lot of people will be very annoyed to learn this, but Adam Smith actually got most of his best ideas and best lines from medieval Islam. Like the pin factories actually comes from Al-Ghazali in 1100. He had a needle factory. No? Okay. And it's made possible by what? By Sharia, because Sharia is civil law that operates outside the purview of the state. And as a result, you can have markets, and since they get rid of usury, that's the other thing that happens. Instead of debt cancellation, which is continued in China, but in other places, they instead just get rid of interest taking. It's illegal. Debt peonage becomes illegal. And so in Islam, since they don't have that, they can have these markets that operate completely outside of the purview of the state. You can write a check in Mali and cash it in Indonesia, and it's all civil courts that take care of it. So it's the first time you really get an idea that markets run by themselves and don't really need governments. But, since they are have a real free market, which isn't enforced by the state, they don't assume it's all about competition. That's like a minor element. The assumption is that it's all really an extension of mutual aid. All right, so be this as it may, you get that world of the Middle Ages, which looks surprisingly good. Slavery largely disappears. I mean, it's kind of rough in Western Europe, but Western Europe is kind of a barbarian backwater anyway. All right, so what happens around 1450? It starts to go bad. By 1492, you get all this gold and silver coming in from Americas. You go back to gold and silver currency. Slavery comes back in a big way. Standing armies and giant empires come back in a big way. And that's the period that's ending now. 1971 is the date that most people set for when we go off the gold standard, and Nixon sort of takes $1 off the gold standard as the sort of key point of transition. And very rapidly after that, you see a whole series of changes. Of course, we get credit cards, which are hardly anybody's using in 71, very quickly taking over so that you have cashless transactions become the rule within a generation or two. You have financialization of capital. Most profits from American companies no longer come from making or selling anything, but largely from financial speculation. You have credit's going to save the world. Microcredit will save the third world. 401ks and mortgages, all that stuff that blows up in 2008. And the question is why, and why it seems to have gone so horribly wrong, because we have a series of terrible debt crises. These first the third world debt crisis, now the debt crisis that's hitting everybody other than the third world right now, have happened ever since. And the reason, I would say, is because, in a way, we're doing things backwards. If we do look at this in broad historical perspective, what we learn is that whenever you have a system of virtual money, where people don't assume that money is a thing, but assume it's a promise, it's an IOU, it's a social arrangement, such as in ancient Mesopotamia, or such as in the Middle Ages, well, you have to set up some sort of mechanism to make sure the thing doesn't go crazy. Usually that means, invariably that means, setting up some mechanism to protect debtors. So you can have periodic debt cancellation, you can have anti-usury laws where interest taking is banned entirely, and instead you have profit sharing. There's a number of things you can do. Usually it's some giant overarching cosmological system beyond the purview of any state, whether it's sacred kings or biblical prophets or the world religions, canon law, Sharia. Be it as it may, it has to be something big. Now, we do set up giant overarching institutions like that nowadays, but what do? We set up the IMF to protect creditors against debtors. Basically, we did it backwards. S&P, all these other institutions like that, they come up with this idea that nobody should ever default, which is absurd. And sure enough, we have endless series of debt crises. In fact, I like to say, when I'm being provocative, which is often, I like to say that the sort of idea that people had in most of world history of the worst case scenarios, everybody falls so deeply into debt that they start having to sell themselves into slavery. It's like nightmare scenario. This is what we always want to prevent, and that's why we have all these laws. Well, if Aristotle were here today, he would probably think that the distinction between being so indebted that you are selling yourself to work for others all day long, 12 hours a day, or being so indebted that you are renting yourself to work for others all day long, 12 hours a day, as something of a legalistic distinction. And you would think this is it. This is the nightmare debt trap, and most people in the world are falling into it. But, if you look at this in broad historical terms, you'll also see that 30 years or 40 years is nothing. We're talking about 500-year cycles here. And people are beginning to wake up to this. We still have time to get it right. And I think the social movements that are coming out since 2008 around issues of debt are precisely recognizing that. If we're moving into a period of virtual money, money is just a promise that we make to each other. It's just a set of IOUs and social arrangements. Those can always be rearranged. Make a promise to someone, circumstances change. You negotiate, and the big players always do that with each other, as we've discovered in 2008, when trillions of dollars of debt was made to disappear by the waving of various types of magical wands. So I think what people are saying is, well, if democracy is to mean anything now, it means that everybody gets to weigh in on what sort of promises are made, what sort of promises are kept, and when circumstances change, what sort are renegotiated. And I think that's the political moment that we're in right now. A question, yes.
So in this, I have to say it's fascinating, thing along the same line. In this era of fiat currency with runaway debt explosions, if I can ask you to speculate, what do you think would be a good way to look at, what would be a good rate of risk, what would be a good risk-free rate of return on investment as an adjustment to?
Risk-free rate of return on, go on.
If we had a fair society, if you could define a fair society by edict.
Okay, I'm now the dictator.
How we used to have, you say we used to have jubilees and canceled debts. So short of having a jubilee, money, debt is a strange thing. Most, somebody mentioned an example. If you have a pile of grain, it gets eaten by rodents and slowly diminishes and rots. But debt is funny because it accumulates over time rather than diminishing over time. Would you argue for us having a negative risk-free rate of return on investment?
I would argue, actually, Would you please repeat the question? The question. What's that? Oh, I understand. Yes. So the question is, if I could dictate my own economic policy, what sort of rate of return would I dictate? A negative one, such as through natural spoilage, equivalent, rather than imposing an idea that money necessarily has to grow. That's an interesting question. I mean, it's interesting that our entire sort of perspective on what money should do and has to do goes back to arguments about this in the Middle Ages. Since usury was illegal, the way they got around it was to come up with a notion of interest, which was originally a late fee. So the idea is, you're not paying interest, you're not renting money, which is wrong. You're just charging people for failure to return it on the basis of the idea that money would grow, because this is all between merchants at first, if you were investing it. So you can ask for 5% rate of return because money would normally, you'd get about a 5% rate, investment rate. And that 5% number is kind of stuck with us in a way, because, it's about the number that any economy is expected, it really ought to grow. If it doesn't, there's a problem. And it's interesting that it's exactly the amount of the originally stipulated rate of return. There were usury laws until quite recent. I guess 1980 they actually got rid of them, which held it down to a fairly reasonable rate, or what was considered so at the time. Myself, I actually do think a jubilee would be reasonable. So in a way, I would jump forward from this. I end the book by throwing that out, and I'm a radical, so I'm not going to be stipulating rates of return. I'm going to say we need to just wipe the slate clean conceptually altogether and come up with a new way of thinking about the system. So I think a jubilee is useful as an idea because it's not only would it be nice, because a lot of people could really use debt forgiveness right now. A lot of the big players got it, and everybody else didn't. But because it would allow us to reconceptualize what we're doing here and realize that money isn't what we thought it was. So what kind of system we'd come up with in the wake of that, I've got a lot of ideas, but I want to leave that as open as possible. So I just sort of ended the book by saying, rather than come up with a plan like that, we just sort of create this sort of cataclysmic event which will sort of allow us to start asking those questions. I've heard recently, I didn't know this, someone told me, that the Boston Consulting Group, which I guess is Jeffrey Sachs's people, ran a model to see what would happen if they actually did a jubilee. They said that it would cause severe economic disruption, but rather less than you would get if you don't have a jubilee. So either way we're screwed, but you'd be a little less screwed if we did it that way. So it turns out that it might not be a bad idea. I think that we should start thinking about completely radically different forms of money entirely. Interest-free systems would be possible. The reason why things like Islamic banking don't work is because not everybody's doing it. If you force people to do, profit sharing rather than interest taking, if everybody did it, it would work. 1, 2, 3.
Is there any historical precedent for the amount of debt we're seeing today, governmentally and personally in America, and how it's all over the globe at the same time?
Yeah, it's very odd because, let me repeat the question. Is there any precedent for the sheer amount of debt? I would say probably not, but unless you want to count the South Sea bubble or something like that. You do have these speculative crises that crop up periodically, but the mystery is just how many people owe things to each other. You have to start asking yourself, well, who's it all owed to? Everybody seems to be in debt. It's sort of puzzling in a way. I would say no. And one reason why is because there seems to be this feeling since the 70s that basically all social problems can be solved through debt. One theory I saw, which is kind of interesting, it's the autonomist reading, Midnight Notes Collective. It's a group of Italian autonomous Marxists, but they had this very interesting reading of the two phases of post-war capitalism. What they basically said is that, after World War II, they kind of gave a deal to sort of North Atlantic white working class, and they said, okay, if you guys don't become commies, we'll give you, free education, free healthcare in most places anyway. We'll give you social benefits of various kinds, and social struggles between 1945 and 1975 were more and more people asking in on the deal. And there was a tie between productivity and wages. So the lines go up together, increases of productivity are met with increases of wages. Since the 70s, the deal is clearly off. And one reason is because they reached a kind of crisis of inclusion. That you can't actually give that deal to everybody without fundamentally changing the nature of the system. So first minorities, so you have the civil rights movement, other people who've been left out of the deal want in, people in the global south want in, women want in, feminist movement. Reaches the point where the system it just sort of snaps, and you have this fiscal crisis, oil crunch, ecological crisis. And they say, all right, deal off. We'll give you another deal. No longer will wages be connected with productivity. You can all have political rights because political rights don't necessarily give you any economic benefits, but you can have credit. So credit solves everything. Everybody's being, that's why you have microcredit saves the third world, why you have 401ks and mortgages, and there's this huge extension of credit. And you could say the same thing happened, right? More and more people want in on the deal. And more and more people are getting credit to the point where people, they're just doing these crazy subprime scams and things like that are beginning to run the system. And when it cracks, it looks almost exactly the same. You get the oil shock, you get the financial crisis, you get the visions of ecological catastrophe. It's the same thing all over again, except at this point, it's not clear what they're going to come up with next. So in that sense, yeah, you have this unprecedented series of bubbles and built on bubbles, built on bubbles. And I'm speaking as someone who was working in the global justice movement, and we were doing our studies for the G20, and we was part of several intellectual collectives where they the activists kind of told us, all right, well, they're all meeting to come up with their evil plan, tell us what their evil plan is likely to do so we can oppose it. And so we'd figure it out, I guess they're gonna have to do green capitalism, declare an emergency. We had various ideas for what would be a viable solution. And they kept not doing it, they just fight each other. It's in fact, one of the reasons why the global justice movement fell into such a problem is at least in the 2000, we knew what their evil plan was, and we could oppose it. And now they don't seem to be able to come up with one. We had better ideas for their evil plan than they did. So we were sitting around saying, well, come on, guys, come up with your formula, we can fight you. And they wouldn't. So they're sort of stuck on this credit bubble system. It fell apart, and they haven't quite come up with what they're going to do next. So I'm waiting.
taking the other side of coin, the debtors get extra help. Why should anybody pay the debt at all?
Why should anybody pay debt at all? Well, I mean, you could say the same question of all those guys who were bailed out on the bankers. I mean, moral hazard works on both sides.
Well, I mean, it's the same case.
Yeah, I mean,
I think that they should have been helped either.
Yeah, no, a lot of people think that, but it's interesting that they got helped. I mean, because as a lot of people point out, all this mortgage debt, if they just paid off the mortgages, that would have bailed out the banks in itself. But they chose to give it to the banks and not to the mortgage holders. And this is a pattern that you do see throughout world history, is that debt means something totally different, depends on who it's between. When you have debt, between two poor people, if somebody wants to make a loan to their brother, it's usually because they want to give him a gift, but they don't want to say that, save face, say it's a loan. If he can pay you back, he will. Between equals, between people who know and like and trust each other, debt is just a broad morals feeling that you should, come through for somebody. And between the big players, it's the same too. I mean, you see this all throughout history, like, even early Sumerian documents, you have people saying, oh, well, of course you're not going to charge me interest because we're both gentlemen, this sort of thing. When the big players are in trouble, debt can always be renegotiated too. What seems to be sacred or treated as if it were sacred is not debts between equals, but, debts between the people on top and the people on the bottom. Because all of a sudden it takes on a completely different color. So yeah, I suppose you could come up with a morality saying like even equals should treat debt as exact, precise, quantifiable, and unforgivable. But it seems that you're not going to convince people who actually like each other to not forgive each other when they're in trouble. Instead, it seems more reasonable to expect everybody to do it. Apply that uniformly rather, because that philosophy of debt as something that can never be forgiven, as something that is sacred, really only crops up in situations of sort of structural coercion, of extreme inequality.
How much of our sense of debt is biological, how much of it is from society, and how much of it is regulatory?
Okay, so the question is how much of our sense of debt is biological, how much of it is from society, and how much is regulatory? By regulatory, you mean just sort of imposed by... Right. I see. Oh, well, in terms of biological, my argument in terms of biological, instincts is, it's not like they don't exist. Clearly they do. And I think it's very naive when people say, oh, we're just a tabula rasa written on by society. No, we're not. We have all sorts of urges. But I would emphasize the all sorts. Generally speaking, in any situation, we have biological drives like making us do 1,000 different contradictory things. So, freedom is our decision which one to act on. In the book, I sort of map out 3 different sort of ways of thinking about the morality of giving and taking of things. One of which I call communism, from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. One of which I call exchange, and one of which I call hierarchy. Exchange is based on principles of reciprocity, but hierarchy is based not on the opposite. It's like if you do something, you're expected to do it again. And all of these things are operative at any moment, and you could and usually what you're doing is a kind of mix of these different types of principles. So biologically and even that kind of fundamental sociality, yeah, there is a degree to which you're always going to be able to think of things in terms of debt, but it's never the only way. So you're always playing around with sort of different ways you could frame it. And in terms of regulation, well, what's interesting is when you try to justify things in the big picture, very often that's when you fall back on language of debt and reciprocity. You see this all the time, we're dealing with feudal lords in the Middle Ages. If you give somebody a gift, you're expected to do the same thing again next year. In fact, you need a special document, like if I give a gift to a king, I have to make him sign a paper saying I don't have to do that next year, because anything you do between unequals is a precedent, you have to do it again. However, then when they want to talk about what is justice, why is our society just, they'll say, well, it's all reciprocity, lords fight for everyone, and priests pray for everyone, and peasants make food for everyone, and it's all this sort of equal swap. It has nothing to do with the way things actually operate on the ground. So we might call this a sort of like overall social regulatory or justification level, where people are saying, nobody actually says, well, you haven't really been fighting for very, very much this year, so I'm going to give you less food. Or your prayer level is down, or you've been praying more, so we're going to give you more food. It's nothing to do with the way people actually interact, but they like to think of this idea of debt and reciprocity as a language that justify social relations, which often operate on completely different principles. Yes.
I live in San Francisco, and there's 14,000 people since 2008 who have either had their houses foreclosed or are in process. As banks were bailed out instead of mortgages paid. And I think 2 million in California. Are there historical precedents, or what would it look like to build a movement for a jubilee to relieve our debt instead of 9 years?
Well, there's a huge history of that. Peter Linebaugh has. Oh, I'm sorry. The question is, there's massive foreclosures going on here in California, including San Francisco. People are being kicked out of their homes by banks that have themselves been bailed out by the public, including those people who've been kicked out from their homes. And what would it take to create a mass movement? Are there historical precedents for that? The answer is yeah. As I say, the vast majority of social movements that have existed in history have been about debt. There have been debt strikes. There have been, seizing and destroying the records, which of course electronically is now harder to do. In the Depression, there was a systematic policy of disrupting sales when they'd foreclose on farms. All the farmers in the neighborhood would show up at the auction with guns, and somebody would bid $1. No one dared to say anything else, and they'd give it back to the farmer again. So there's a huge amount of precedent for that sort of thing. You can never do it the same way twice. The problem with organizing debtors politically is that debt is very alienating. It's much easier to organize people when you have a bunch of farmers in a neighborhood, they know each other. But what we have now is, most people who hold student loan debt, mortgage debt, don't actually know people in the same situation, or people are even ashamed to admit it. There's really no forum in which people can compare notes and come up with common strategies. So one strategy that people have been using has been some sort of pledge. Some people are doing a student loan project where they're saying, all right, if we get 1 million signatures, we'll all stop paying simultaneously. But it has to be something like that, because it's very, very difficult to build you're taking such a risk when you default or when you threaten to. You're taking such a risk that it's very difficult to do that based on trust of other people you don't know. So that's the question, how you organize people to begin with to do. Okay, you can decide who then.
Is there a great variance across cultures between how debt is handled for those who are in the paid labor force and those who are not, such as parents and children, such as, very traditionally men and women? Okay, the question is, in traditional societies or other societies, are there differences between how debt is handled in the paid labor force and unpaid relations, debt, how debt between, so you're talking, give me an example. What children owe their parents?
I thought you meant that, yeah.
If before you could only work inside the home, couldn't really give your goods out to people outside of that, how would that work between you and anybody else who won't be able to answer that? Right,
so how do you deal with the relationship between debts between people within a household or where there's a community of property and between you and outsiders? It's an interesting question because, in fact, it's a perfect example of what I was talking about, how we try to frame everything in terms of exchange. There's some need to do so, even things that don't work that way at all. And the other point that I was making about how we try to frame things morally in terms of debt. Because you'll often find people saying, well, this is how we repay our parents for the pains of childbirth and what they do. But in almost every case, it's a metaphor. It has nothing to do with how people actually relate to each other. So often when you see how people are actually interacting, it's on it's on a principle, has nothing to do with debt. You're not calculating equivalence at all. But then when you want to think about it in a bigger picture, suddenly you're trying to figure out some way to say it's all about debts. I actually use a story about this famous Canadian naturalist whose father presented him with a bill for everything he owed him up to the age of 21. He said, okay, here's how much it cost to pay the doctor to deliver you. Here's your primary education. You know, he had it all worked out. And he said, and he gave him the bill, and the guy paid it and said, fine, to hell with you, I'm never going to speak to you again, and walked off. But that's what it basically means, you know, because when you're paying a debt, it implies we need have no further relations. So the idea of actually paying a debt between people that you love is utterly insulting. You'd only do it if you really want to have nothing further to do with each other. But nonetheless, people like to frame it in those terms. One of the most fascinating concepts I discovered when researching this was the notion of the milk debt. This is a medieval Chinese Buddhist concept. What they did was they calculated what they thought was the exact number of pecks of milk you absorbed from your mother in the first years of your life. And that's a fundamental debt you owe to your mother. Said, okay, you owe exactly 37 pecks of milk. But then they would say, all right, to pay back even like 1 day's worth of milk would in fact take 400,000 years of feeding her off your own personal flesh. I mean, so it was a way of saying, like, you could not conceivably pay this debt. So why are they calculating as a debt at all? It's again that same tension of you want to frame debt as morality, and they say they're the same thing, but as soon as you do, you say, except not really. It's completely ridiculous, isn't it? So that tension, like the need to pretend that it's a debt, but then once you say it, to say, actually, no, it's not a debt at all. It's absurd to even think of a debt. Why are we saying this? Recurs over and over and over again. And it's because commerce gives us this idea that we want to frame everything in commercial terms, that we really ought to, that we start doing that, and then we say, no, actually, we can't.
Let's thank David.